right, so what do we think of these Davidic expectations that are inserted into this Hallel psalm?
Right. So some of the things that like messianic expectation, like in Mark and in most of the Gospels, like reminds me of is kind of a deep cut in if you've heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Dead Sea Scroll community at Qumran, this idea that there's kind of like a dual identity to the Messiah, or maybe even two Messiahs that would come, one that is very like royal and kingly, and then one that is more like prophetic and priestly. And so like, how does Jesus like fall into those roles? Like, is he fulfilling what like the Jewish communities at that time believe the Messiah would be? Is it some sort of mirroring of what happened in like the Maccabean revolt and like trying to get independence? Like, is he following in that? Is he in the line of like Zerubbabel? Is all of those things? Like, who is he? So that's what I'm reminded of in this, but that's not necessarily in the text.
All right.
I think it's an important thing to put in the question of who's the intended audience of this. So like, what is the text trying to activate, I guess? So that I think it's legitimate to ask those kinds of questions. I'm looking at the way that Mark plays with this messianic secret, right? Which is, I think, a device of dramatic irony throughout the whole thing, right? The audience knows something that the characters, those poor Slavs, don't get, right? And those poor Slavs, the more they're insiders, the more they're supposed to get it. And we even get, right, all the way up to the discussion over, well, then who do you say that I am, right? And this whole thing becomes this moment where the insiders, you think they're about to get it. And then as soon as Jesus says, okay, so Messiah, great, now I'm going to die. And Peter takes him aside and says, no, let me explain to you how Messiah works. It's not going to be that way. That doesn't happen, right? And so throughout, nobody seems to get that the Messiah dies, right? And what that's supposed to mean for the audience, as opposed to the characters, is something maybe we come up with later. But I think it goes right to the very beginning of the very first verse, the beginning of the good news of, right, the Messiah, Son of God, which is another royal title. Messiah is, Jenna, you point out, right, is the royal title for kings. Why does David refuse to assassinate Saul? He says, well, I'm going to send my hand against the Lord's anointed, the Messiah, right? David and Samuel, after his falling out with Saul, anoints David to be the next Messiah, right? So Messiah then becomes one of the royal titles of the Davidic household. So David is a Messiah, Solomon is a Messiah, Rehoboam is a Messiah, and so on, all down to Josiah and his sons and grandsons who are the last kings of Judah. And then there are no more Messiahs, right? Because there's no more Davidic kings. And the Babylonian exile happens, and the Persians allow exiles to return. And then there are priests, right? Because there's a temple.
Sorry to interrupt, also there's another Messiah, because there's Cyrus, who is the Messiah, who's like the anointed one of God. So that comes in again, that title's given to somebody who's definitely not a part of the Davidic line and definitely not an Israelite. And so it's used again in a really odd way.
It is, right? So that's one of the many responses to what happens when you don't have the Messiah anymore, when you don't have a Davidic king. That comes from the part of Isaiah, right, that is imagining, oh, here comes Cyrus, he's defeating the Babylonians, and sure enough, he does, and he sends people back to rebuild the temple. So Cyrus is in the role of kind of a Solomon, right? Because he's allowing, right, so he's the Messiah, he's the Son of God, the same way Solomon is the Son of God. When Nathan goes to David and says, that idea you had about building God a house, a temple, nice, but here's how it's going to happen. God's going to build you a house, a dynasty. So your son will build a temple. Solomon builds the temple, and Solomon has a prayer saying, God fulfilled the promise to David. And all the rest of that becomes a way of saying, okay, the Davidic kings are the stewards of the house of God, the temple. And God is the steward of the house of David, the Messiah. And so the prophet saying, well, we get to go back and rebuild, but we're part of the Persian Empire. How is that going to work? What happened to Davidic messiahship? Well, okay, Cyrus. Not everybody's going to be on board with that. You mentioned Zerubbabel, right? Haggai and Zechariah think Zerubbabel is going to bring back the Davidic dynasty. Then we don't hear about Zerubbabel. And what happens throughout the rest of the Second Temple period for centuries, you got people kind of with the kids' backseat question on the road trip. Are we there yet? Are we there yet? Right? What happened to this restoration, this return? If, you know, the exiles get to go back, we get to rebuild a temple, but our land is ruled by a foreign king. We don't have our own independence. What happened to the Messiah? The high priest becomes not just the religious, you know, administrator in charge of the temple, but becomes a role of civic responsibility as well for the Persian administration, and later under the heirs of Alexander and the Greeks. The high priest is a really important role, and we have certainly evidence from the Second Temple period, maybe a little, you know, maybe earlier, maybe not, where priests are also anointed. And so that's why you have that tension when the Maccabees, right, as the sort of country cousins of the high priests, they come in and they throw off the Syrian Greeks, and they establish their own high priesthood, and now they're running a little city-state, right? What happens when you get independence for the temple? Well, you've got political independence, and they start taking the title of king as well, and people who are looking for a Davidic Messiah are like, no way. And the folks out at Qumran have said, don't combine those two roles. We're looking for a Davidic royal Messiah, right, and a priestly Messiah,
right? And
you do not do that, and they're rebelling against the Hasmonean conflation of those roles. So I think that's a really important point, right? That we've got lots of different questions about how to solve the problem of the exile that endures throughout the Second Temple period. So when we talk about, right, the kingdom is coming, what does it mean? It means the restoration of Israel's sovereignty and the setting right of all the mess, right, that has begun way back with the Babylonian exile, and that God's reign is going to be reestablished. So the beginning of the good news of Jesus, right? The good news you all mentioned last time is, you know, on the one hand, it plays with Isaiah, the bearer of good news, announcing the return to Zion. On the other hand, it also plays with the Greek word for announcing the entry of a king into a city, or the announcement or the birth of a new heir to the throne, or what have you. And then, so we're already thinking, on the one hand, that, right, there's a whole royal valence to all these titles: good news, Messiah, Son of God, right? Solomon is a son of God as well, right? God says, "Oh, your son David will be my son," and we get the royal Psalms where God adopts the king on his coronation. The Lord said to my Lord, you know, put your enemies at the feet, right? This day I have adopted you. All those things that come out of the Psalms. What Mark doesn't say is Son of David there.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's the thing that just is thrown completely under the rug until Bartimaeus, right on the approach to Jerusalem, says, "Son of David, have mercy on me," right? And now we get, Jesus comes into Jerusalem, and the first thing the crowds do is they insert the hope of the Davidic messianic restoration right there in the entry to Jerusalem.
Yeah.
And that sets up the conflict of, who is this guy and what is he doing? And by what authority are you doing these things? And, you know, let's scripture off with the authorities and see who has the better explanations of things. And Jesus gets the last word by flipping on its head a question precisely about, how does David call the Messiah, you know, Lord, if he's his son? It's as if Mark has no idea that Jesus is supposed to be a descendant of David and is trying to excuse that he isn't,
Right.
or that Mark thinks that that's a really incomplete way of understanding what Messiah means, because a Messiah, son of David, is not somebody who can who succeeds if the Romans crucify him. And so Mark is trying to then come up with a different way of understanding what Messiah, son of God means, instead of Messiah, son of David, I think.
Well,
okay, sorry. I said I had a lot on it, so that was kind of my dump.
Well, so this, I think, so that starts to bring out some really important things that, if we're being attentive readers, we notice in the text. Number one, and you've kind of spoken around this a lot, Jesus never claims the title Son of David for himself in this gospel, right?
Yeah,
that is,
he pushes it off.
Right, he pushes it off. The crowds put it on him, and he pushes it off time and again. This is the only synoptic that does not start with a genealogy as well, that ties him back to the Davidic line, like both Matthew and Luke do, which seems to be an important thing structurally, because Mark, I think, to Brandon's point, isn't interested in affirming Jesus's lineage from David, because it seems to be his point is that whatever it means for the Messiah to be Son of God, it is not to be it's not to be a descendant of David within this political dynasty, but it's something else. And so genealogies are not included in there.
And Bethlehem stuff and all the rest of that stuff that's in the infancy narratives for Mark and Luke, for Matthew and Luke, just
right.
none of that tying to David.
Instead, we start with John the Baptist, the prophet who goes before announcing Jesus, and we start with the baptism narrative. Is the baptism narrative serves like the place of the infancy narratives.
Yeah.
Which is then really structurally interesting in terms of thinking about the idea of Son of God, right?
Mm-hmm.
That this is the origin story we get for Jesus, is Jesus being baptized and the Spirit descending on him like a dove, and a voice coming from heaven, "You are my Son, whom I love, and with you I am well pleased."
Right. The echo of the Akedah there. Right.
Right. That's Mark's version of the infancy narrative. Okay, so trying to rework what Son of God means, if it's not just another messianic royal title associated with the Davidic line and with the dynasty. Seems to be a big thing for Mark's gospel. We also then, there seems to be a big question around kind of the dating and what is the audience actually wrestling with themselves as readers, which then helps, I think, to explain why Mark is so interested in this question, right? And this starts to take us into what happens. Well, we've got two other things we should probably get to before we move into Jesus's conversations in the temple. But just a little, kind of look ahead. His biggest like teaching chunk is on the temple and the destruction of the temple. And so the argument, last time I said, a lot of scholars date this very, very right before the destruction of the temple. There's also a really good argument to be made that this is like immediately after the destruction of the temple because of this long discourse. And so what does it mean then, in light of the fact that the temple's now gone? What was Jesus on about? What does it mean to be God's people in this moment? Which brings us to that question of audience. Who are the original readers of this text, right? They're Jewish followers of Jesus who are trying to figure out what Jesus was all about in light of the fact the temple's just been destroyed. So whatever expectations of the restoration of the state, or all of that's definitely gone now, which maybe then starts to plug us into the messianic secret, right? So thinking about what is the audience wrestling with as listeners, that original audience, what are their big questions? And maybe that will help to get why Mark seems so concerned about this idea of distancing Jesus from the Davidic line, or pushing that off, rejecting that, and claiming this Son of God title in a particular way. You guys following that? Yeah? Brandon, you look concerned with something I said. Yeah? No? Correct me. No, we're good? Okay. All right. So a couple of things then, if we're all on the same page. Not so interested in Son of David. Basically, summary for everyone listening at home. Not so interested in Son of David. Very interested in Son of God. And there might be really good reasons for that, given the immediate socio-political situation of Mark's original audience. And
the title that Mark likes to have Jesus use for himself is Son of Man.
Right.
Right.
So it's like you want your comic books and you're reading like the Justice League, right? And if you're really a big fan of Batman, right? Bruce Wayne is, the son and heir to an aristocratic family, and that's what he uses as his resources to, bring justice and fight bad guys. And that's sort of like bringing back the kingdom of David, right? The heir to an aristocratic dynasty to set things right. Mark isn't gonna. Mark has shelved Batman, and he's now reading Superman, right? Somebody from out there who has these superhuman qualities, who's going to make everything, who's going to bring, truth, justice, and the Israelite way. I don't know. And so you have these sort of different kinds of expectations, different sets, different ways of talking about that. And I think it's really important to locate where that Son of Man language comes from, because it's just Aramaic and Hebrew for guy, human, right?
Yeah.
But it comes up out of but Mark makes a big deal of citing that in the trial scene. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of us.
Yep.
Right. To reference not just Daniel 7, right, but referencing it in a way that takes out the one like a Son of Man and simply says Son of Man, which sounds more like the Enoch version of that, where the Son of Man is an actual figure who's going to come down from heaven and set things right.
Right.
So how do you have both a David and a heavenly figure? And for Mark, I think the answer is you have to have the Messiah die and be resurrected, and that's how you combine those two roles. So he sort of pushes off the David stuff because that ends at the cross, but where it continues is in the resurrection. And I think that's where he's going with the Son of Man stuff. Did I get way too out ahead of us?
No, that's fine. That's fine. And I think, honestly, I think that the illustration of like Batman versus Superman, that Mark is more.
Which is a terrible movie.
and Batman's definitely the cooler superhero, but in this case, that is I think a really helpful analogy, right? That it's not just the rich guy who's coming in and using established channels or like understandable ways to establish power and authority, but it's this guy coming from another planet.
Right.
That seems to be more what Mark is interested in terms of the Davidic title versus the Son of Man title. So I just want to point something out in verse 11 of chapter 11. Then let's talk about the fig tree and what goes on there, because that frames the conversations in the temple, which we want to move on to. So he enters Jerusalem. He goes into the temple courts. He looks around at everything. But since it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12.
Yeah.
I find that really funny. Brandon, you seem to find it funny. Yeah, everyone's chuckling, right? Because like you do this whole triumphal entry thing, but it's already late, so you think, let's just go back out now.
I think it goes again, like he didn't feel a need to make like a spectacle. It kind of makes a parody about it too. Like it's anticlimactic. Like he came in and then he's like, and I'm done. Like no show of any power, no sort of like continuation or like celebration, nothing. It's just like, and we're done. We're tired. Goodbye.
Yeah. He just sort of like he gets off the donkey, I guess, and fades into the crowds and all the tourists looking around at all this stuff. Yeah. Right. And he slips back out of the city and he's like, okay, we're done here. I planned next day's spectacle. Right, because he's got one up his sleeve and it's pretty good, but yeah.
But yeah, it feels really anticlimactic, and I love it, the little because it was already late. He went out to Bethany with the 12. Now the 12 were with him coming in, and you have to wonder, like, what are they like? The fact that it includes the 12 are with him again. It's like, okay, guys, and let's turn around. Mm-hmm. Like what? Like just I'm imagining the looks on their faces, like, and we're turning around back out to Bethany. How far is Bethany from the Temple Mount? Like, how far of a walk is that? 2 miles?
It's not that long. It's like you can do it in probably an hour or so.
Yeah, not that long. On the other hand, you just walked an hour.
Right.
To turn around and walk back. Yeah. I'm just imagining there's the anticlimactic nature of this scene and also the kind of the frustration, right? Like, and we're walking back to Bethany. But then something really important does happen in Bethany the next day. Actually, the next day in Bethany, after he comes back into town.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
When they came from Bethany, he was hungry.
Right.
So somewhere in between Bethany and the Temple Mount, and seeing in the distance. So I'm wondering if you know, he went out to Bethany with the 12. I wonder if that's an echo of the Akedah, where the binding of Isaac, where you get, you know, Abraham and Isaac continue up the mountain together, and then Abraham comes back down the mountain, and Abraham and the servants return together.
Yeah.
Because Abraham also sees the place from afar, and the whole tradition, you know, via Chronicles and so forth, connects Moriah and the temple and all the rest of that. So connecting the site of the sacrifice of Isaac, or the near sacrifice of Isaac. Because, you know, seeing in the distance is kind of an interesting little thing to point out as well. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, so, okay, this struck me this time because I've got a very large tree in my backyard, and it was just Passover last week. And seeing in the distance a fig tree in leaf, he went to find out if it had any fruit. When he reached it, he found nothing but leaves, because it was not the season for figs. And I was looking at my fig tree yesterday, and there are little figs already on it, and the leaves are just coming out. And by the time the leaves come out, there's gonna be figs. And I'm trying to figure out how this, like horticulturally, is lining up with the celebration of Passover in the spring. And it gets hot earlier in Israel than it does Oregon, which means there should be figs at Passover.
Should there?
Or at least they should be coming in. Like, I'm wondering about this. Like, if it's in leaf but the figs aren't, are they not ripe yet?
Have you tried a bitter fig?
Yeah, they're not good.
No.
But he found nothing but leaves. It doesn't say there are unripe figs.
For it was not the season for figs.
Mm-hmm. I'm just confused by this.
Yeah, because it like gives us a reason why there's no figs, because it's not the season. But
yeah, when do, I mean, figs, like, I can appreciate it's not the season for figs and there's leaves, but then they should be unripe ones.
What variety of fig tree is yours?
I don't know. It was here when we bought
Yeah.
it. It's a big one. But okay, but here's my point: is if it's not the season for figs, but it's springtime and there's leaves, there should be unripe figs on the tree.
Maybe.
And it would still not be the season for figs.
Right.
But it's not like it's the end of summer and the leaves are still there, but the fig harvest is past. Right? You following?
Right, so like essentially like there's something faulty with the tree. Like it should have at least something other than leaves on it. Is that what you're saying?
Or that the point, it's not the season for figs and there's nothing but leaves. There's actually unripe figs there, but it's not the time for them yet.
Well, in the Song of Songs, right, the rain is over, the winter rainy season is over, the sound of the dove is heard in our land, the fig gives off its scent, which might be, it at least would allude to, say, maybe what, flowering or something. Do they flower? I don't think they flower.
They don't, no. I was surprised
They
by
just
that.
go straight to fruit. Yeah.
So I'm interested in this though because of timing, because this is clearly a deeply symbolic story. Right? Because Jesus goes to it, he sees nothing but leaves because it was not the season for figs. So either it's too late for figs or too early for figs, but the only thing that makes sense, if Passover is in the spring, it was in the spring 2,000 years ago, right, Brandon? Yeah, okay. So there's not any, okay. It was still in the spring. There should be unripe figs there, right? So it not being the season for figs would have to do with unripe fruit, not past the time. Okay.
So there's no fruit at all, and we're thinking that that may be a significant detail.
Or that there is fruit there, and it's just, there's nothing but leaves, is idiomatic for something that, or like, there were leaves, but there weren't any figs ready to eat, right? Because what I'm wondering is how this ends up working symbolically when he comes back, and what the fig tree is representing. And because of these questions around like expectations of Davidic messiahship, reworking of the Son of Man. So yeah, is the tree, like, so the question, I guess the question I want to hold in our heads as we keep reading is the tree faulty? Or is it that it's not the right time yet?
What's interesting is Matthew, and I don't know if Luke has it too, but I know Matthew kind of inserts another reason for why this is in here, because like, oh, he had the conversation like, oh, like the tree, I hope nothing ever happens from you, he destroys it, blah, blah, blah. And the disciples are amazed that he was able to make it wither so quickly. And so it makes the reason for this to show maybe Jesus' dominion over nature, which is a very like Jobin thing of like, oh, he can control all of these things. So Matthew tries to bring in that solution, but that's not like found in this text. This doesn't even have the disciples hear it, but they don't say anything like, oh wow, we're so amazed, look how he destroyed that tree.
Yeah.
So I just want us to hold that question of is the problem that the tree is faulty, or the problem that it's not the season for figs? Because the text gives us both of those possibilities in itself.
What's confusing me is that, like, yes, the tree could be faulty, but like it gives us the reason here, but that doesn't seem to make sense. So yeah, I don't know. But again, it could be like idiomatic or some difference in translation or something, but I'm not sure.
Well, and I wonder too, if is the tree faulty because he goes to see if it has any leaves. So there's a possibility that trees at this time often don't have things. You know what I mean? So he's not like, oh, I went to go see the fruit of the tree, almost like it's certain, and then he's disappointed that it's not there. He's wondering if it's there.
If it has any fruit.
Right.
Yeah. So it could be, so the other thing with fig trees, a lot of them do produce 2 rounds of fruit. You get your first crop and then your second crop a couple months later. So it could be in between those 2 crops.
Okay.
Sort of in between period. But it's interesting. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I just really like that this is the next episode right after he had this very precise, detailed information about what the 2 would find when they went in to get a donkey, and what that donkey was going to like, and what people were going to say to them, and exactly this and exactly that. And now he's going to see, I wonder, is there any fruit on that tree over there?
Right.
Like, why does he not know?
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Of the many things that this story just confounds me. I just don't understand.
Well, and then we just leave it, right? And we don't get back to the fig tree again until
Next morning.
Sorry?
Next morning, verse 20.
Yeah, the next morning, right?
I think what's funny about this is, like, yeah, the disciple or Peter says, Rabbi, look, the fig tree that you cursed is withered. Jesus replied to them, have faith in God, and I assure you, or it's just like we were talking about in Messiah, Brandon, for you who you haven't seen it, Almasi, there seems to be this like hit and miss, like they ask him something and then he responds with something completely different, does not answer the question. And to us it seemed like who is this guy? He's not even answering their questions. But like, not that this was a question for Jesus, but Jesus also just like starts on this long kind of teaching after a fig tree withers. So it's I was reading it aloud with my brother because we watched Messiah together for the most part, and we were both laughing because we were like, oh, okay, well that kind of is like Jesus then, to not answer or like to go off topic kind of. But
and Jess, I'm sure you never do this to your students, but I'm sure some of my students have felt that way about my answers to their questions too.
I'm sure mine have felt that way sometimes too. I try to watch their faces, and when they get that kind of glazed confusion, like, let's try that again. I don't let them just live in the mystery. Okay, so here's the reason I brought your attention to like when they come back the next day is because, of course, what happens in the middle of that story then seems really important. right? Because we have this kind of narrative frame of the fig tree and a narrative closure on the fig tree, but something really important happens in the middle of that, which is what's usually called the cleansing of the temple, right? Jesus goes in, he reaches the temple courts and began driving out those who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves, and would not allow anyone to carry merchandise through the temple courts. And as he taught them, he said, "Is it not written, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it into a den of robbers." The chief of priests and teachers of the law heard him and began looking for a way to kill him, and they feared him, because the whole crowd was amazed at his teaching. In the morning as they went along, they saw the fig tree. And then it's, you kind of get this, like this closing to that, and then they're back in Jerusalem again. So I guess the question is, why is that fig tree framing the temple story?
I'll try something. I wonder if it has to do something again with like dominion and authority over like not only like like human institutions, but also like nature. So showing this like, oh, this like sovereign power that he is kind of exerting, but in this very like subtle way that only a few are seeing this like framing narrative of the fig tree, but then other people are seeing this kind of like spectacle of like clearing out the temple and some of these like later conversations he has around the temple. I wonder if it has something to do with that, like it's leading into this like, oh, who is this person that has this authority to tell a tree to wither and also to clear out a temple? So kind of showing both aspects of the story, maybe.
Okay.
So I have a thought that's like kind of stretched, but we were talking about how possibly like the fig tree being faulty. And I don't know, it seems similar to like the misuse of the temple. And so maybe Jesus is just clearing out all like the wrong, whether that be with a fig tree that hasn't properly given fruit, or with this misuse of a holy space.
Right. And when we talk about like the misuse of the temple here, it's not what is going on exactly that makes this a misuse of the temple, or what might be the indication there that something is not right. Because so these money changers who are buying and selling money, it's because you need to have temple coin to buy your sacrifice so that you can offer your sacrifice, right? Because if you try to make a road trip with an animal that's perfect and unblemished for your sacrifice at the start of the road trip, sometimes over 2 or 3 weeks of traveling, it's not so perfect and unblemished by the end of it.
Right.
And so it's better to buy your sacrifice at the temple so that you can be sure that, you know, it's still perfect and unblemished when you offer it. Okay. And you need to then use coin, because you can't use Roman coin, because Roman coin's like
the Tyrian half shekel was used in the temple for whatever reasons. And if you've got pilgrims coming from not just from Galilee like Jesus and his followers, but from all over, people would come because this is again this is the Passover. It's the celebration of the genesis of the people, is the exodus from Egypt. So it's the way in which everybody then has a means of exchange. So these are things that are necessary for the temple to function, right? You've got to have, and the doves are the poor people's sacrifice, right? Anybody is supposed to be able to offer a dove, even if you can't afford a whole sheep. But people would often pitch in, especially for Passover, and send somebody on behalf of their entire group to send, to have a lamb that they would then, slaughter at the temple, bring back prepared so everybody could have a little taste of Passover lamb. So this is what makes the temple work, and it's really important for what makes the temple work for Passover. So if he's disrupting it, why?
Right.
Especially if he's come down to celebrate and to do this himself, right? He's come down and he's going to have a Passover meal, and they're there for the same purpose.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So why does he then go in and say, you've made it a den of robbers? What might be faulty here? So okay, a couple of things that I've heard, and I think is it Marcus Borg argues that the tax rolls for the Roman taxes were kept in the temple, and there was a bit of a collusion between the temple authorities and the Romans. One possible theory. I think it's N.T. Wright who argues that the temple had become the site of Davidic messianic expectations, and this is a challenge to that. I'm not finding either of those particularly satisfying.
Temples in the ancient world are tax centers and administrative centers in general.
Yeah.
The Roman authorities, as you mentioned, they bring the legions that are stationed in Caesarea on the coast down to Jerusalem specifically to keep an eye over everybody from the fortress that's right there over the north wall of the temple complex. They look down and make sure that nothing is getting out of hand. Somebody coming in and making a disturbance like this is going to catch some attention from people that you probably don't necessarily want to catch attention from. And lots of people, right? We talk about the crowds. Nobody does anything to Jesus when he comes in on the donkey, and nobody does anything to Jesus at this point either. Why? Because again, they are afraid of the crowds, because the crowds love his teaching, right? So these crowds, who are they? They're pilgrims. They're just like Jesus and his followers, who are faithful Jews who are coming to the temple precisely because they need to participate in the temple sacrifices for Passover. And that doesn't mean that they're always going to like the people running the temple, right? The cost of sheep is more this year, or I didn't get enough exchange for my coins, right? It's as if you were going to the Super Bowl, but you couldn't buy your tickets in advance, right? The sheep is kind of is not just the concession stand, but also the cost of entry.
Yeah.
And so you can see how people might be frustrated with that. At the same time, interrupting the box office at its busiest season is a real disruption for all of these, for everybody involved. And
right.
that the crowds are supportive of this suggests maybe that there's a general discontent with the folks who are running the show, and the fact that whether they're involved with the taxes or whatever, the people who are running the temple are also having to in some way cooperate with the Romans, because neither of those two groups wants a big disturbance. They want this to go off smoothly and not give too many people too many very particular ideas about national freedom at Passover.
Right. And so I think that the crowds here are actually really helpful to figuring out what Jesus might be finding fault with in the temple system. It's not that they're changing money. It's not that they're selling sacrifices, but collusion with the Romans, or the sense of appeasement, could be it. It seems to me, in keeping with some of the other sort of themes that we've seen in the Bible generally, is that economic abuse is really important. So profiteering, potentially, right? Why would the crowds be unhappy with the system if they feel the prices are unfair, right? That's the number one reason people get annoyed in situations I'm thinking about trying to get Notre Dame tickets to a game. If they seem too expensive, you're annoyed, right? When you go
price gouging on toilet paper.
Price gouging on toilet paper, right? To make it really, really relevant. Right? When you go to Disneyland and you're with the kids, and it's how in the world can they possibly charge $5 for a churro? That's $1 sort of concession. Right? And so the fact that crowds are in such in support of this makes me feel like the hint might be something to do with price gouging, something to do with people profiting off a system that's supposed to allow everyone access. Doves are supposed to be the sacrifice everyone can offer, but they've raised the price of doves this year, and it's costing why is it costing so much
Yeah.
for doves all of a sudden, right?
I mean, I think about right now, like Passover food, because you have to do so much cleaning. I tear apart my kitchen and boil it for several days and get everything ready for Passover. And then to buy the food, like some of the things that I can't or won't prepare myself, you have to buy, and it has to be specially marked kosher for Passover.
Mhm.
And yeah, it's more expensive, and yeah, it's harder to get, and you're gonna do it because it's Passover, and you got to do that, right? If you're gonna celebrate, you do that. At the same time, you're thinking, why does it have to cost this much, right? Why, especially this year, where I'm like, sitting and having to prepare my own seder and not with other people, right? What in the world, right? Why does it have to cost as much? Now, I'm going to complain about this, and I may suspect, oh, somebody's got a racket on the certification process. I'm still going to do it, right? Because that's what we do, right? So the people here, the crowds, I think that might be another way of thinking. Maybe I'm just saying the same thing you're saying, but
Yeah.
Well, and I think there's definitely a nod to that, like this crowd is like a lower economic class, because it does say like the benches of those selling doves. It doesn't make it that it's just like this blanket like sacrifice, or that like they're just like selling these other animals. Like, no, it's like, no, specifically the benches that are selling the sacrifices to the people that are part of a lower economic class. And then there's a crowd that's happy about that. And so then you're like that it's being overthrown. So you're like, okay, clearly it's the class that is tied to that sacrifice is the one that Jesus is like there for and like overthrowing this for.
Which then, okay, so let's start putting this in the big narrative arc that we've been working through this term. We've seen with Sodom and Gomorrah, we talked about economic abuses going on there all through Genesis. Yeah. We talked about economics around the Joseph story, right? And some of the interesting things that go on there. We've seen repeatedly God sort of apparently intervene on the part of people who are economically disempowered, especially women who are in positions of economic disempowerment. We didn't spend a lot of time in the prophets, but we talked repeatedly in class about that the prophets, the one thing they really seem to be on about is economic abuses of the poor seems to be really fundamentally opposed to what it means to honor what God what God is wants for his people, right? That there's something about abusing the poor that just cuts at the heart of what God does and is on about. And all this is happening during Passover, which is of course celebrating the liberation of Israel from slavery, which is like the biggest model of economic abuse, right? And so and the fig tree of course is a symbol for Israel quite often, right? In the biblical text. And so maybe the cursing of the fig tree here, we talk, is there something wrong with this particular tree that it's not producing fruit? Maybe we're seeing again a theme we've seen all the way through from page 1 of this big story, right? Which is, if you're taking advantage of the people who can only afford a dove, you've kind of missed the entire point about what it is to be the people of God. And you've missed the point of Passover. Like, you are missing the point of Passover if you are economically enslaving the poor at Passover.
Well, that goes to Amos's use of the Exodus story as well, right? So for all these abuses of all the nations round about, God is going to send destruction, right? He kind of gets up on, some soapbox at Bethel, and he lambasts all the nations around, and then he says, and for 3 abuses of Israel and for 4, I will not relent. And you're like, what? And he continues to say, the whole people I brought up out of Egypt, because you should know better. You should know better than to exploit the poor. But
well, and I think too, even like it says like the chief priests and the teachers of the law, they should definitely know better, because they also have the Jubilee as like a law of like, oh, like this should be happening. And regardless of when you think like that was authored and all of that, like it's still like in Torah, like it's there. Like, no, you have to actually like care about like land tenure and like give it back to the people, and that this should be happening cyclically so that there isn't like widespread systematic oppression.
Which is also why it's really interesting that we have a question about who gets to use the cult and the colt, and who's not the cult, the colt. Sorry, we're moving from the priests back to the donkey. The owner, right, is invoked in that thing, but we don't have any idea of whose fig tree this is, or whose property it is that Jesus has just destroyed, right? That their livelihood depended on getting figs from the tree. But it maybe portrays him actually as a gleaner.
Yeah,
right?
which is then like reminds me of like, oh, like Ruth is modeling after like the cleaning laws that you have in like Deuteronomy, like what is it, like 24, like 15, somewhere in like the latter half of that like book, about like, oh no, like she has this like right to go to the corners of the field and glean from the fields, and that is how God is like providing for her, and that this is a requirement of those that have like power and money to like do this for those that are disenfranchised.
Yeah. And it's interesting then, because of course this, I mean, not that you ever want to trust chapter breaks, just as a general thing, students out there, anyone watching this video, don't ever think chapter breaks are actually narrative breaks. They were put in by some monks at some point, and don't watch them. But no, that said, when we look at the passage that actually ends this chapter,
they reflect somebody's interpretation.
They're somebody's interpretation. They were somebody's interpretation. And this one feels, I don't think it's actually not in a great place at all, but the very next thing that follows in chapter 11, that ends chapter 11, is by whose authority do you do these things, right? So he's simultaneously being positioned as the gleaner, but he's also being positioned as the one with authority to command.
I also wonder, I mean, the lesson, right, the explanation for, look at the fig tree, he says, have faith in God. Truly, I tell you, if you say to this mountain, be taken up and thrown into the sea, and do not doubt in your heart, but believe what you say will come to pass, it will be done for you. So I tell you, whatever you ask for in prayer, believe you have received it or are receiving it, and it will be yours. And whenever you stand praying, forgive if you have anything against anyone, so that your Father in heaven will also forgive your trespasses. So, I mean, again, like what Cassie was saying, like, how does this follow from that? But at the same time, like, forgiveness is also understood in terms of debt. That's one of the main metaphors, especially in the Second Temple period. And what you ask for in prayer, I mean, maybe he should have asked for there to be figs when he went to look. I don't know. Is that the reason we're supposed, maybe this is regret. Oops, I'm sorry. I zapped the fig tree. I should have been forgiving. I don't know. I don't want to like push this too hard, because I think there's probably some humor in this as well, but it just, I don't get it. It's perplexing. But it does raise the question of like, I think it does anticipate the question of by whose authority do you do these other things, right, in the temple? You have to be praying with belief, and you have to be forgiving so that your trespass may be forgiven also.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I'm really dissatisfied by this reading. I can't figure out anything.
I'm increasingly satisfied with this reading and positioning it in terms of economics and debt as a way of understanding what's going on in terms of what's happening at the temple, and perhaps with the fig tree as being cursed because something is not going right with it. And it has to do with abusing the other, especially economic abuse. Right. That for me works with the bigger sort of themes that we see coming through the text as a whole. But I'm then really interested in 13:28.
Okay.
At the very end of the temple discourse, the discourse on the destruction of the temple. Now learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as its twigs are tender and its leaves come out, you know that summer is near. And so I'm just interested in this in terms of, like, the lesson from the fig tree. We've just had this experience of the fig tree.
Right.
The temple's, he comes and disrupts the money changers and then predicts the destruction of the temple.
I gotta say on that, and I've been wondering whether that goes with the fig tree earlier, because here it seems he understands how fig trees work. And earlier he doesn't. It's not the season for figs. Why would you find any fruit there? I don't know.
Mhm.
Right. It seems like in this instance, like he's talking about some sort of like resolution to what's happening, like historically and politically. It doesn't necessarily seem like it's a callback to the other fig tree, but it is a fig tree. So I don't know. It seems odd. I don't know if you can read them as speaking to one another, but they're in this text. So I think you have to in some sense.
And they both are coupled with conversations around the temple.
Right.
True.
Like, and they're very close together by the same author in a book that we've all agreed moves with incredible pace from scene to scene. So it seems to me that there's something going on here that involves this question around like why the fig tree is not doing what it's supposed to do in the first scene, although it's not the season for figs. So there seems to be something weird happening there, that we get a resolution somehow at the end of this entire temple discourse. I mean, in some ways, maybe the better unit to think about is the cursing of the fig tree all the way through to the end of his temple discourse.
Right. I think especially too, like, oh, it's not acting how it should, but it can. And like it can actually do what it needs to do, and it can make it to summer, and it can do all of these things. Like it can move past this. Like wondering if that's like what it's trying to get at. Like, no, like this tree can actually be a flourishing thing. And then you can decide what the tree is a metaphor for, if it's the temple, if it's all of Israel, if it's whatever, some sort of community. But I think, yeah, maybe it's trying to say some sort of arc of like, oh, it's not doing too well here. Like there's something corrupt and not good about it, but it can be good.
Right. No, I think that might start to work with what we see Mark doing as a text as a whole, making sense of the destruction of the temple. Yeah, this is really bad. Things were not, there were some problems. And now the situation we have is really bad.
Yeah.
But something good is still possible. The summer is still coming.
Right.
Yeah.
And how are you going to work?
And so in that case, sorry.
Go. No, you go.
No, I was in that case, maybe the may no fruit ever be found in you again isn't actually as permanent as it sounds, like many of the sort of prophetic exaggerations. But more to the point, the idea that the framing of this might actually, include from the fig tree episode to the end of the temple discourse, a question about authority rather than, I mean, it's really tempting, right, for us to want to say there are economic reasons, there's a rationale, there's a principle behind this. But ultimately, authority is simply who really exercises power. And so Jesus going in and disrupting everything in the temple could, in one way, simply be a bid for saying, who's in charge of this temple? Who runs this? Whose is this, right? Just as the fig tree is not mentioned, as it's kind of ownerless in a way. Who has charge not only of the temple, but who has charge of the seasons, not just the festival calendar, but the time it is in the universe, I guess.
Right.
Thinking about it.
Yeah.
And so in that sense, right, the question of who has authority and how that authority is negotiated over who has the right interpretation of scripture in the intervening chapter might actually be an interesting way of holding some of this together.
Yeah. Well, and then thinking about that too, that this is all a lead up, although it happens on two separate days, to introduce the fig tree, it's all about Jesus entering the temple and teaching in the temple, right? And if part of the, who is this man?
Yeah.
Is it possible that this is somehow God? The idea of Jesus, entering the temple and teaching in the temple as the lead up to this with the fig trees, speaks to Brandon's point about authority, right? Who is it who has the authority to come in and curse a fig tree or overturn the money changer? And there might be reasons for it. There may not be reasons for it, but who has the authority? You get into then immediately the parable of the tenants, right? About people like doing a good job, and sending away the master's like overseers, and then finally sending the son. You get the question of paying taxes to Caesar. Another question about who has authority. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. stamped with the image of and to God as gods, and that should call everyone's mind straight back to Genesis. Who is it? What is it that bears the image of God? A question about the resurrection. Who has control over afterlife and the eternity and what it looks like when the resurrection happens? Who has control over the commandments? What is the greatest commandment? Who has the right to interpret Torah? And then, as Brandon pointed out a few minutes ago, the question about who is David's son, and how is it that he calls David Lord, or sorry, David calls him Lord, and then we get to the widow's offering.
Yeah.
Which brings us back to the poor, which might have been what we were looking at before, and then the destruction of the temple, the prediction of the destruction of the temple as they're leaving the temple, right? So it's, again, thinking about like the narrative setting, that Jesus goes in, he teaches all this teaching on authority as the widow's offering ends it. Like, as this sort of summary of what generosity looks like.
Right.
And also, I think that's really important. Who is it that actually maintains the temple? Not all of these people who think they're in charge. It's actually this widow who gives what she has.
Right.
And who is the one who becomes kin for those who aren't kin, who takes the case of the widow and the stranger and the fatherless, right? Well, the king is supposed to do that, right? But the king, again, it's a bid for the royal power. The king becomes the kin for those who don't have kin in that network system, and the king does that sort of as a reflection of how God does that, right? And so that idea again of a royal claim that is not the way you might expect it. That also challenges and subverts, right, the aristocracy running the temple and the Roman legions who are, watching very anxiously over the lead up to Passover.
Right. So we see Jesus then calling the people back to that. She's the one who maintains the temple. It's the poor who maintains the temple. And the true king
and the Messiah, but what is the Messiah and what's the nature of the authority, right? Is the other piece of that.
Right. That's where I was going. She's the one who maintains the temple. And what is the true king? What is the true Messiah? The one who cares for the widow, the one who is father to the fatherless, the one who fulfills these roles of care and guardianship and hesed, as we were talking about in Ruth, really.
Yeah.
That's what this is about. All right, we're going to start up again with our next video in a bit, and that will be looking at what goes on. We might have a little bit on the destruction of the temple, but really then jumping into the passion and the strange ending. So join us again for that video, which will be next on the playlist.